Hey everybody, Tim Albrick here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week we take questions from the YFP community on retirement planning. We discuss how to determine the optimal amount to save for retirement, strategies for dealing with market downturns during retirement, and how different investment options such as stocks, bonds, and real estate can impact retirement savings. Let's hear from today's sponsor, First Horizon, and then we'll jump into the show. Does saving 20% for a down payment on a home feel like an uphill battle? It's no secret that pharmacists have a lot of competing financial priorities, including high student loan debt, meaning that saving 20% for a down payment on a home may take years. For several years now, we've been partnering with First Horizon, who offers a professional home loan option, aka a doctor or pharmacist loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single family home or townhome for first-time home buyers, has no PMI, and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to $766,550 in most areas. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii, and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher, and a condo review has to be completed. While I've personally worked with First Horizon before and had a great experience with Tony and his team, don't just take it from me. Here's what Peyton from Tyler, Texas had to say about his experience with First Horizon. Aaron, Cindy, and Marilyn were very easy to work with. As a first-time home buyer, I shopped around for lenders at the onset of the process. Aaron was always very quick to reply and provide me with any details I requested in order to move forward in my decision to select a lender. Once I selected First Horizon, Marilyn and Cindy did a great job of keeping my wife and I informed of the process. Closing was a breeze yesterday at the title office, and I sincerely appreciate the team going above and beyond to keep my interest rates locked despite extending closing due to negotiations with the seller. I've already shared my positive experience with many pharmacist-only groups, and I look forward to my brother, also a pharmacist, refinancing with you guys when he decides to. So to check out the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to start the pre-approval process, visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Tim Baker, good to have you back on the show.
Good to be back, Tim. How's it going?
It's going well. I'm looking forward to this episode. We're going to be talking about retirement planning, a topic that we're seeing a ton of interest in, getting lots of questions about. You did a webinar recently around retirement planning, lots of engagement that came from that. So we want to answer some of the most common questions we're getting from the YFP community around retirement planning. We're going to go through 4 different questions around how do we determine how much is enough? What are some of the strategies to deal with market downturns while you're in retirement? I know something you've talked about before, that important window before, leading up to, and after, and how we think about the investment strategies. We'll talk about some of the different investment options that can impact retirement savings, and then we'll wrap up by talking about some of the healthcare costs in retirement. So let's start with the first question, Tim, which is how do you determine the optimal amount saving needed for retirement? And really, what are the factors that should be considered when setting what this number is, what the goal is?
Yeah, it's a huge question, Tim. I think, I'm going to answer the question with a question is like define optimal.
Yeah.
Right. So like optimal, what we've talked about, is, should die with zero be the goal? And, what I mean by that is there are a lot of people that, they'll save, and maybe the goal is to pass on some, money to their heirs. I think I've said this on the podcast before. My parents have said to me like, hey, we want to make sure that like when we die, like we give, we give you and your siblings some money. And I'm like, I don't expect that. I don't really need that. I'm not really banking on that at all. And maybe when I'm older, I would want the same thing for my, for my kids. But the die with zero concept is kind of like, you can't take it with you type of thing. So you're kind of spending down your portfolio, you're giving it away, et cetera, et cetera. And right. Maybe there's some, somewhere in between where you don't want to be right on the needle there. You don't want to be with zero. So you have a little bit more cushion. So, I think that would be the big thing. Is like, how do you define optimal? And then the factors I think are so important. So like, what type of lifestyle do you want? I think in a vacuum, what most people I think want is to kind of live a similar lifestyle than what they're living as they're working. So they don't necessarily want to be more lavish. Don't necessarily want to give up things either. Unfortunately, some people have to give up things just because of, poor planning, or they have to work longer. So, where do you want to live? What's the geography? What's your housing situation? That's going to be the biggest fixed expense. The biggest expense in retirement typically is housing. What are your hobbies, activities? Are you taking care of grandkids? Are you jet setting? Are you working? Are you not working? Are you volunteering, consulting? What does that look like? And I think from there is, estimating, what your retirement expenses would look like. So I mentioned, like, what are the fixed expenses? What are the variable expenses, which could be big trips? Maybe you're paying for kids' weddings. Maybe it's a medical expense. And really kind of zero in on that. Unfortunately, Tim, the B word doesn't ever go away, right? So understanding what your budget looks like is I think an integral part of retirement planning. There are rules and things and way that you can slice it. There's some planners that will look at the tax return and then assume, like, whatever's on last year's tax return is what I need for this coming year. And that's kind of a very top-down approach. A bottom-up approach is a budget. You could use a rule of thumb, like a replacement ratio. So, hey, if I make $100,000, a 70 or 80% replacement ratio means that I need $70,000, $80,000, in that year of retirement. Looking at accounting for inflation. So do you think inflation is going to go up? Is it going to go back down to kind of the 3% levels? The big question is like, what's the retirement duration? Nobody knows that, right? So, some people are like, oh, I'm going to, retire at 65 and I have a good 5 or 10 years in me. Most people, live longer than what they think they're going to retire. And that's probably the trickiest part about all this. Unlike, other types of planning that are similar to this, like education planning, we kind of know that, hey, our goal is to kind of get through 4 years, maybe 8 years of, education.
Yeah.
Here, it could be 5 years, it could be 45 years. We just don't know. And that's kind of the major wild card. But then understanding, like, what are your sources of retirement? Is it Social Security? Is it a pension? Is it an annuity that you buy? Is it your traditional portfolio? Is there other types of, is it real estate income, whether you're cash flow in real estate or it's a liquidation event? Are you selling a business? Is there part-time work there? So I think all of these play a part in it. And then kind of how you distribute the cash also plays, and how, you handle taxes. So from a distribution perspective, are you looking at, what we've talked about in the past, which is a flooring strategy, which is a very conservative strategy? Is it a bucket, where, and this will be, another question that we have is like, how do we account for like volatility or, in the market? Is it a bucketing strategy, or is it the systemic withdrawal strategy where it's, hey, we're distributing 4% no matter what, or we're being flexible depending on what interest rates or the market's doing? So lots of different ways to kind of, go about this. But I think defining like what optimal is for you is going to be important. And again, that's why a lot of people are like, I just want to, die with zero. That plays. I think the best place to start in terms of the optimal amount of savings needed for retirement, to answer that question, is, I think starting with a nest egg calculation is the best way. It is the best way, in my estimation, to deconstruct a problem, and problem's not the right word, but a scenario that is years into the future. That's a big freaking number. So, and when I was talked about this, like when we would do retirement planning at my past firm, you'd be the client and we would say, okay, now it's time to talk about your retirement. Based on our time value money calculation, you need $3.65 million to retire. All right, let's talk about your insurance. On to the next thing. And we could see kind of like maybe the color come out of your face, maybe that little glossy eyed look. And it didn't connect with people. So, it got me thinking, how can I make this number impactful to you today in 2024? So a nest egg calculation was says, okay, this is the number, 3.65 million, but then what does that mean to me today? And we compare it to what's currently in your retirement portfolio, what's your contribution rate, how is it allocated, and then how does it compare, to what you potentially need? So are we running a deficit, meaning we're behind on that 3.65 million, or are we ahead, meaning that we're overfunded? So to me, that's the starting place. And again, it's not a perfect, calculation. There's a lot of assumptions in there in terms of investment returns and inflation, and actually when you're going to retire and when you're potentially going to die. We're estimating all that, which you would do anyway in any type of, scenario analysis. But to me, that's the best way, I think, to make that big number, that kind of unknown, a little bit more digestible. There's other ways, Tim, that you can look at it, whether it's Monte Carlo analysis, where you're looking at, a randomized portfolio return, or other things that are related to, economic variables that you can say, hey, we're going to run thousands of scenarios. And what it shows you is, hey, you're a 85% chance of success. And that what chance of success means is that there are assets left at the end of the plan, whether you set that for age 90, 95, 100, or whatever that is. That kind of is the next level. The rule of thumb is, what people have heard of as a 4% rule. So, if you're looking at your optimum savings plan and you have $500,000 in retirement, if you use 4%, that means you have $20,000 over a 25, 30 year retire. So you might say, hey, that's not enough, so I need more. So obviously the way to reverse engineer that, Tim, is to say, okay, what do you need? If it's 40,000, you use the 25X rule, you need $1 million. And that's just a 4% rule, invert it. So to me, in terms of practical things that I would have a listener, it's like, okay, are you getting the match? Get to that, race to the 10%. So your employee contribution, again, this is a vacuum. I've talked with prospective clients that had lots of credit card debt and other things that are going on. I wouldn't necessarily prescribe this for them, but, get to the 10% employee contribution, then eventually, get to a phase where you're maxing out, and then use IRAs or brokerage accounts to kind of supplement along the way as you can. But remember that this is a problem set, Tim, that I think a lot of people think that they have control over that they don't.
Yes.
There's a stat that says 40% of people don't work to their expected retirement age, either because of health issues or they were eliminated from a job, et cetera. Those types of things, I think, where in my mind I'm like, oh, I'll probably work till I'm 70 and Shay 65, but I can lose my marbles between before that. Like, who knows? So I think the best time, again, I'm a planner, so I'm biased, but I think the best time to plan is now. And the sooner you can kind of look at where you're at and kind of be able to adjust where you need to go, the better. One of the things that I would always kind of lament working with at my last firm was that we only worked with like pre-retirees and retirees. So people would come off the street and they'd say, hey, I'm 55 years old. I'd like to retire in the next 5 years. I have $50,000 to my name. I have credit card debt. Like it was almost like it doesn't add up. The math is not math. And so, those are all the kind of things that, go into this. And, it's a huge thing to kind of deconstruct, but I think, looking at this as in a vacuum is not necessarily ideal. You want to look at all the different parts. We talked about this with our own plans and kind of, where we're trending and things like, but it's a big question, I think, and there's just a lot of ways to kind of, look at it.
Yeah. The thoughts that were coming to mind as you were talking, Tim, is I think there's risk here to oversimplify this and be overconfident in this. And what I mean by the oversimplification is, like, you can run numbers in a calculator, but if you're not having some of the important discussions and questions of the inputs into that calculator, then we're not doing the work that needs to be done, right? You mentioned, like, what do we mean by optimal? Like, what does that actually look like? What does it mean to be living a wealthy life in retirement? As you mentioned, some huge variables of, are we working at all? Are we working part-time? Is this 55? Is this 64? Might we be caring for elderly parents? What does travel look like? What are all these things?
Yeah.
And then, when we think about even that word retirement, I think can carry a meaning that you and I might look at that word and say it means two very different things, right? And so, when you talk about the nest egg calculation, to me, that is where the value really lies. To me, the short answer of how do you determine the optimal amount of savings needed for retirement? Nest egg calculation, 3 words. But to do the nest egg calculation and put in all the inputs and variables, which again, as you mentioned, are assumptions and things might change and move. And there are things that we think we have control over that we don't, but it's the closest we can get, and we can modify, update that, look at it over time. In order to put the numbers in the calculator, we got to have some really good conversations. And this, to me, is really where the planning comes to base, where we're not just trying to shove money away into accounts that were, somebody said I should put money in a 401k or an IRA or an HSA or whatever, or we're looking at these big scary numbers in the future thinking, am I ever going to get there? Looking at the individual variables, having the discussion and the conversations, answering those questions, plugging those in. And then, as you mentioned, bringing it back to today. So important, especially for the people that, for someone who's 2-3 years out from retirement, that may not be as critical as for someone who's in the middle of their career or even in the front half of their career, where, we got to come up with a number that I can actually put my arms around and do something with today, because otherwise I'm going to look at this number 30 years into the future, 20 or 40 years into the future, and say, the math just doesn't even seem possible.
Yeah. And one of the things that when we go through the script your plan, which is our second meeting, and the way that we kind of start building a financial plan, we go through what's called a get organized meeting, which is we bring up the client portal, and we're basically trying to get to like a clean snapshot of what the balance sheet looks like. So the assets, the things that you own, minus the liabilities, the things that you owe, equals your net worth. And our job is to hope, the idea is to kind of grow that quantifiably, to get your net worth to grow over time. The second piece of that is script your plan, which is all about like goal setting, right? So it's like, okay, now that we know where we're at, where are we going? And with those two things in place, that answer of it depends that I always give Tim transforms into, this is given your balance sheet, given your goals, Tim, this is what I think you should do. So it's no more it depends, because like we know what your goals are, we know what your balance sheet is, this is what your goals are. But part of that script your plan exercise, when we would kind of talk about a timeline, I would ask the question of, hey, like it's July 2024. Let's fast forward a year. What does success, and what does success look like? And then we go 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. The further you get out, the further away that you go, the harder it is for you to kind of imagine that self. So with retirement planning, the way that, with the way that I would do this is like, I kind of, I would say, hey, let's get into the DeLorean. Let's go 88 miles per hour, rev it up. We get out in, 2054. So it's 30 years from now. What does success look like? And for a lot of people, it's like, I don't know. So I'm like, okay, like how old your dad? If I'm 40, my dad's like, imagine yourself as your dad, like picture yourself as a 70-year-old. What does success look like? So it's just like the nest egg, where we're trying to like equate the numbers from a script your plan, from a lifestyle perspective. Is the further that gets out, the harder it is for us to kind of relate to our 10-year older self, 20-year older self, 30-year older self. So if there is a group or a person that very closely, that you can say, okay, like if I'm in there, and you probably do that anyway. I'm like, oh, like when I'm retired, I'm not going to do what my parents are doing, or I am going to do what my parents are doing. So you can kind of like take that. But even 10 years out, Tim, if you look 10 years back from, if you look back to 2014, how much in your life has changed over those 10 years? Like things, like time flies. But, to me, it's like you look at, time is so hard for us as humans to conceptualize. And it's no different in something like this. So I think it's like really kind of going through those like thought experiments and, kind of assessing, because I think so much of this is really about the numbers, but when you deconstruct this, it's really not. I think, if you're working with a financial planner, again, shameless plug, I think the numbers are going to be fine. Yeah. Especially if you have enough time. The longer that you're engaged with the plan, I think the more success, whatever version of success. It's the people that don't, I think, is where you kind of run into problems. But to me, it's really important to kind of deconstruct, like the answer to that question is what is optimal, and then plan around that. The nice thing about, having decades, so to speak, in a financial plan is like the micro things that you do today really steer that frigate to where you can have success, in the long run. So, but it's an interesting, it's an interesting problem set, because it is a huge number, and it's far in the future for a lot of people. It doesn't seem real, and I have a lot of people that, will work with us in their 20s and 30s. They're like, I'll never be able to retire. And when we show them how, the math to get to that, like, I think that's transformative. Now, I think the second piece of that is like, okay, like, what is a happy retirement? What's a successful retirement? And I think people are starting to figure that out, that it's not necessarily a destination, right? It's just the next chapter. And then, especially with sometimes farmers are like highly, people that are higher achievers, their role and identity gets really tied up together. And it's like, okay, if you step away from your career as a pharmacist, like, who are you? What do you do? Like, and that for some people can be really difficult to kind of, again, unbolt.
Tim, one thing I want to say, and separate topic for another day that we can dive deeper into, we've talked about in the show before, but when you talk about time being hard to really wrap our mind around, especially for folks that are early in their career. Your 2014 example is a really good one. When I think back to 2014, like, it's a distant memory, and it feels like, yeah, we were doing some savings and things now, but if it weren't for things like automation, you could see how a 10-year period slips by you without having the intentionality. This is why we believe so firmly in automation as an important part of the plan. Yes, we got to do the hard work up front. Yes, we got to check in periodically. But once we start to kind of remove ourselves from that equation and we do that hard work and then we turn it on, whether it's automatic contributions, it could be automatic savings buckets or other things,
Yep.
that's where we're going to start to really see the progress and prevent the scenario where we say, how did those 10 years go by and I didn't make much progress on my retirement planning?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so important because we just get into this like autopilot and you wake up and it's like, where did it go?
Yeah. All right. Second question we have is, what are some strategies for dealing with market downturns during retirement? If we even zoom this out a little bit more, I'm guessing this person might be asking, given the volatility, certainly the market's had a good run lately, but it's been pretty volatile, right? Over the last couple of years. So for those that are, in what you call that eye of the storm around retirement, or coming up on, just got to retirement, or maybe they've been in retirement for a period of time, how do we address and deal with some of the market volatility?
Yeah. So this is market risk and you really don't have any control over at all outside of like taking all your money out, take your investment ball home and, and go home. Right. So like, this is where people get scared. They'll go to cash and they typically are selling low, but then they're like, oh, the market's good now. Let me, dip my toe back in, and they're buying high. So, what you're talking about is sequence risk, where it's basically, when the timing of your retirement and the distribution of your retirement accounts matters a lot, probably more so than most of the other investment or the retirement risks that are there. So, so to kind of zoom out of this first, Tim, this question is, the question is, what are some strategies for dealing with market downturns during retirement? So what we're assuming here is that, you are no longer in that accumulation phase. You are in the decumulation, the withdrawal phase. But I think like my thoughts are consistent no matter where you're at. To me, the big things that I look at from a retirement portfolio is I want to make sure that you're in the right allocation and that you're driving the expenses down as much as possible related to your portfolio. And what I'm typically talking about here is like expense ratio. So the right allocation is probably the optimal term. And I think if you look at the rule of thumb that I don't love is the rule of thumb in terms of like how you should have your portfolio allocated is you take 110, you subtract your age, and that's the amount of stocks or equities you should be in your portfolio. So if I'm 40, you take 110 minus 40, and I should be in a 70% stock portfolio and a 30% bond portfolio. Which I think, and it's very much a linear thing. So as you age, you go 60-40, 50-50, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's wrong. I don't think that that's a great rule of thumb. I think that, to me, I look at this almost as like my strategy or my thought process is more of like a cliff. So my thought is like, if I'm 40 years old and I have 30% of my allocation in bonds, I think that's a mistake. And if we zoom out, if you look at stocks, and again, not all stocks are created equal, but in broad strokes, stocks are typically, there's a higher potential for growth with a lot more volatility. Bonds or fixed income, there's less potential for growth, but less volatility. So there's more of an exponential growth with stocks and more of a linear growth with bonds. So to me, what you give up during the accumulation phase, if you're in your 40s, is you give up a lot of the market. The market's still going to go up, but I equate it to like, if you're in mostly equities, it's going to be kind of Rocky Mountain in terms of ups and downs. If you put bonds in, there's more Appalachian Mountains. There's a little bit more, there's less ups, less downs, but there's still that. So to me, I think that a mostly equity, again, this is not investment advice, but I think like mainly in equities in your accumulation phase. And then when you get to 5 to 10 years before and after your retirement age, that's when you're really going to manage the sequence of return risk that you mentioned. So think of that as like the eye of the storm. So let's assume that my retirement age is 65, and I'm being as conservative from a timeline perspective. At 55, that's when I really am going to that's the cliff where I'm going to say, okay, I'm no longer going to be mostly in equities. That's where I'm going to be the most conservative and go to bonds. So instead of this glide path where I'm going from 100% to equities to 80, 90, basically I'm not doing that over a period of years. I'm doing that right when I hit 55. And that's where I'm going into more of a balanced portfolio, which could be a 60-40, a 50-50. And then over those years in that eye of the storm, so 55 to 75 in the most conservative sense, that's when you're going to be the most conservative in terms of your balanced portfolio. And then when you come out of the eye of the storm, that's when you start ramping up the equities again, whether that's 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, which is very different than kind of the, most people, it's like, oh, you're in your 80s, you should be in a 20-80 portfolio or whatever. And a lot of people, it's not sustainable. So the eye of the storm is to kind of get through the sequence of return risk. So, and again, the most successful retirees are the ones that are most flexible. So if you go through like the subprime mortgage crisis or the .com crisis, and your portfolio goes from $1 million to $700,000, and then you're drawing $50,000, for the next couple of years, the portfolio in a lot of cases are going to fail. If you were to delay your retirement and wait for the market to recover 2 years later, it's a completely different scenario. So that to me is what we're talking about here. So, the strategies for dealing that is I think the best thing is to be in the right allocation, is to not do what you're feeling. So I always talk about do the opposite of how you're feeling. So if you get scared, a lot of people should go cash, and in a lot of ways you should be, doubling down and investing. Another thing that we've talked about in this forum, Tim, is something like an annuity, which is hard to really wrap people's minds around. But like if I can peel off $300,000 from my portfolio to supplement Social Security, to say, okay, come hell or high water, I'm going to have the steady check between Social Security and my annuity, regardless of what's going on. For a lot of people, that's a peace of mind. So like the market volatility is not as big a concern, because I'm like, I have all my basic necessities handled, right? So the mental thing of like an annuity might be a big thing. Being flexible, as I mentioned, it could be a bucketing approach where you're like, hey, my near term bucket, my 0 to 5 year bucket is spoken for, meaning I have that in cash or tips, I'm good. So I don't care what the market does, as long as it's recovered in the next 5 years for me to, kind of replenish that bucket. And this is where we're basically have a short term, a medium term, and then a long term bucket. So a short term 0 to 5, a medium term 6 to 15, and a long term 15 plus. And then those buckets kind of replenish themselves as time goes. If we're in a time where the market crashes, but I still have $200,000 in my cash bucket, I don't really care. I'm hoping the market will return in that period of time to replenish that cash bucket, and typically it should. A lot of the most, the Great Depression, the Great Recession, those market recoveries aren't decades; they're typically, 2 to 6 years, 2 to 7 years, that type of thing. So that could be something as well. So, the market does what the market does, and I think those that are best positioned, like they understand that it's not, we're not trying to like game the market. Outside of very few people in the history of the market can beat the market and kind of, foreshadow what's going to come. So it's being in the right asset allocation, it's keeping your expenses low, and being consistent with that structure, I think will get people through any of the seasons that you'll see over the course of an investing career.
Tim, let me mention a few resources for people that want to dig deeper into this. We'll link to these in the show notes. It's been a while, but we did a whole series on retirement planning, digging into the question of how much is enough, some of the alphabet soup of different accounts, building a retirement paycheck, things that you've been talking about. That was episodes 272 through 275. Again, we'll link to that in the show notes. And then episode 305, we did a primer on annuities. A lot of misconceptions around annuities. We try to break those down, understanding what they are, fees, costs. That was a great episode. Again, we'll link to that in the show notes. And then several of the risks that you've talked about, we put together a guide that's all around understanding retirement risks. So it's retirement roadblocks, identifying and managing 10 common risks. That's a free guide that we have available. One of the most popular resources we have. Again, that will be linked to in the show notes as well. Tim, one thing that struck me as you were talking, you mentioned flexibility, right, is a key. And this is a piece I think that pharmacists have a benefit of, right? Many pharmacists work in a position, whether that be hospital, whether that be in community practice, where they have an opportunity to do something like PRN shifts or work part-time and make a good income. And so, maybe the game plan was a full retirement at 55, but because of some of the things that you talked about, maybe they either choose to work longer full-time, or hey, if they want to pick up 15, 20 hours, making 60, 65 bucks an hour, a lot of pharmacists have the opportunity to do that. And so I think that flexibility piece can be really important, specifically to our audience as they're thinking about retirement.
Yeah, and what this to me, this stat still like is unbelievable to me. So these two stats were put out by a paper called "The Power of Working Longer," published in January 2018 by Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research. And basically, it makes the case for working longer. That's kind of the best, medicine for if you have a shortfall in income for retirement. But if we talk about sequence risk, Tim, so if we know the market, so like let's say I'm 65 in 20 years from now. I'm not quite there yet, but say the market is not going great.
Mm-hmm.
Deferring retirement by 3 to 6 months is like saving 1% more of salary for 30 years.
It's incredible.
Deferring retirement by 1 month is like saving 1% more of salary for the final 10 years. So to me, I know there's a lot of pharmacists that are listening to this that I speak to. They're like, I need to retire as quickly as possible. And I get it. I get it. I understand. But to me, like the people that are most flexible from a lifestyle, from a time in, are going to be the most successful in terms of their retirement. So if you have a lever that you can pull, that you can consult, or you can do, you can do a shift or medical, right? Whatever that is, whatever that is, like that's going to benefit you and help the overall retirement picture. So those would be two stats I would leave you with on this question.
That's great. And it's a balance, right? We talk about this all the time. It's a balance between, hey, you make enough of these concessions, and you could always argue, hey, I should keep working longer, right? So we've got to get back to like, what's the why, what's the purpose, but
yeah,
also be in tune with those numbers, which are wild when you talk about 1 month of employment and the impact that it has in terms of dollars that could have been saved.
Yep.
All right, next question. How do different investment options, such as stocks, bonds, real estate, impact retirement savings? And I think, Tim, this is a really interesting question, because one of the things we lose sight of when we talk about nest egg calculations, retirement planning, we talk about these big numbers, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, is that not all dollars are created equal, right? Both in how are they invested and the types of investments in which they're in, and then eventually how they're utilized to build a retirement paycheck. So what are your thoughts here in terms of how do different investment options impact retirement savings?
Yeah. So this question is really about like asset classes. So
Yeah.
when we talk about a traditional portfolio, we talk about a high level, a 90-10 portfolio would be 90% in stocks or equities and 10% in bonds or fixed income. That 90%, you can draw even a finer line. You could have large cap, mid cap, small cap. You could have international funds. You could have emerging market. You could have commodities. You could have, you could have sector funds that are just in biopharmaceuticals or whatever. You could have digital assets. So the big news this year was that they released spot Bitcoin ETFs. Last week, Tim, they released 8 or 9 spot Ethereum ETFs, which have come on the market and started trading last Tuesday. So that could be part of your asset allocation now because they're in ETFs. The bonds at 10%, you could buy a total market bond, or you could buy you could buy munis, you could buy treasuries, you could buy a total market, an international bond. Like there's lots of ways to kind of, slice it. But you can also talk, real estate. One of the things is like, is it real estate? You can hold real estate in a mutual fund or an ETF, or you can hold it directly. So to me, this kind of goes back to the one of the earlier questions is, the more stocks, there's the potential for more growth, but more volatility and risk. The more bonds, less potential for growth, but less volatility and risk. So I think at a baseline, being in the right asset allocation from a traditional portfolio is really important. And this is what I'm talking about is, should you be in an all equity or, a 90-10 and then hit that cliff and then go to a 60-40 or 50-50. That's what I'm kind of talking about from a traditional. But the things that we have to overlay, Tim, and I was talking about this with you a couple weeks ago, I was kind of lamenting the fact We talk about like tax allocation with retirement with your investment assets. So we kind of talk about, we want a little bit in column A, column B, column C. So column A would be like traditional, so pre-tax. So these are, traditional 401k, traditional IRA, et cetera. Then you want a little bit in Roth, which is kind of tax-free since you've already paid the taxes. So this is like when you pour out a Roth, if you have $1 million, all that million is yours because you've already paid the tax man. And then the last one is a taxable account. So I was looking at my taxable account as a percentage of my portfolio. I'm like, it's not exactly where I want. Now, I don't have any designs on retiring before 59 and a half. So I don't really need, that's typically what you use a taxable account for the purpose of retirement. But I know like when I sell my real estate, that's probably going to go into a taxable account. So like right now, I know the plan is it's kind of unequal scales. They'll be equaled out in the future. Or when I sell my share of our business, like that will probably go into partly a savings account, but partly a long-term, investment, in the form of a taxable account. So to me, that plays in a part of this as well. So I think the idea is to be in the right asset allocation. That's what I talked about. Typically, the one that is going to be more stock heavy is going to have more volatility. So the closer you are to retirement or in retirement, the less you're going to want to have, although it's still needed for kind of that longevity risk of like not outliving your savings. Real estate is going to be typically how you're holding it, whether you are a landlord or if it's in a fund. But the things that we haven't really talked about this as part of this is things like digital assets, things like commodities, cash. Right now, Tim, you could, with our cash accounts at YFP, it's paying like 5.1%. So I'm looking at that and like, if I'm a retiree, if I could park my short-term bucket there, I'm pretty happy with that return. Now I know inflation's been ticking up higher, so maybe need a little bit more to offset that. But these are all the things that kind of construct the retirement, savings, the retirement assets. And I think, doing it with a traditional portfolio, but then overlaying some of the other things that you have going on, if you have a pension, that's going to affect how you retire, your allocation is. Because if you have a pension plus Social Security, you might not have to be super conservative because you might say like, hey, most of my things are handled, or if I buy an annuity, I can be more aggressive because I'm not going to have to withdraw that as aggressively as if I didn't have that annuity or that pension. So there's lots of different things, but I think the rule of thumb is kind of look at your stock to bond, ratio, and understand that with stocks, again, more growth, but more volatility. With bonds, less growth, less volatility.
And I think you just gave a great example there why blanket asset allocation recommendations don't work, right? Because, if someone's listening and they have a pension and they have Social Security, or maybe they have an annuity, like the floor that they've created is completely different from someone else that maybe doesn't have a pension or an annuity, and therefore they're going to rely more on withdrawing from their investment. So how much risk they take with the remaining amount of whatever is investable and whatever buckets they have could be very different based on, what those are. And I think this question gets at a couple different aspects of asset allocation, which you talked about nicely, but also a conversation we don't have enough, which is that decumulation, building that paycheck. From what buckets are we taking from, and how do we do that in what order, tax strategies, all those things. And I think for people who are listening that maybe have done the hard work, are nearing retirement, have $2, $3, $4 million, save whatever the number is, that's great. Now, hey, are we thinking about the decumulation side of this?
Yeah. And that was one of the reasons, Tim, after going through the CFP coursework, I decided to do the RICP, which is Retirement Income Certified Professional, because it really tackles that question that the CFP I don't think does the best job.
Yeah.
CFP is all about, okay, accumulating assets and what that looks like. But once you get to that, not the destination, the next chapter, how do you take these buckets of money and build a sustainable paycheck over time unknown, right? And actually, one of the open questions in that is like, if you do build a floor for a client and they're a 75-year-old, but their allocation is something like 90-10 or 80-20, a lot of regulators would look at that and be like, that doesn't look right. But, the justification, that's why you can't have a blanket, this is one rule for everyone. The justification is like, we really don't have to draw that much from that portfolio because the floor is the floor, right? So I remember that being kind of like, oh, that's odd because, again, most most planners, they kind of, they get Social Security in place, and then they say, okay, what's the total return? What's the best optimal way to get the, the portfolio through the, all the retirement years? But it's much more nuanced than that. And I think, it's important to understand that.
And that's why for the pharmacists that are listening, that are working for an employer like the VA or whoever that still has a pension plan, be grateful for that. They're not common, but that's going to play a huge role when it comes to building that floor and creating that retirement paycheck. We've got lots more retirement questions. I'm going to hit pause there. We'll tackle more of those in future episodes. We've thrown a lot of information in a short period of time. Again, we've got more resources. If you're listening to this saying, hey, I want to learn more, make sure to check out the YFP podcast. Again, we'll link to some of these older episodes in the show notes. You can go back and learn more. We've got more information on the YFP blog as well. We have more webinars that will be forthcoming related to retirement planning that Tim and the rest of the team will be leading. So be on the lookout for those as well. For those that are listening and said, hey, I really could use some one-on-one help with a qualified certified financial planner, we'd love to have the opportunity to talk with you, to learn more about your situation, to see whether or not what we offer is a good fit in the form of fee-only financial planning and or tax planning. If you're interested in a discovery call with Tim Baker to learn more about those services, you can go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You'll see a link there to book a discovery call. Thanks so much for listening, Tim. Great stuff. We'll catch you again next week.
Sounds good.
Before we wrap up today's show, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, First Horizon. We're glad to have found a solution for pharmacists that are unable to save 20% for a down payment on a home. A lot of pharmacists in the YFP community have taken advantage of First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan, which requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers and has no PMI on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. To learn more about the requirements for First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan and to get started with the pre-approval process, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of Your Financial Pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.